I wasn't ignoring the HOA. I was sitting beside my mother's bed, watching her struggle to breathe, wondering if she was going to make it through the night. That's when the notices started coming in. Warnings, fines, threats of enforcement. The HOA president didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't ask why my lawn hadn't been touched or why my trash cans were still out. He didn't care that I was barely sleeping, barely eating, barely holding everything together. He just kept escalating. And when I finally realized how far he was willing to push while I was dealing with the worst moment of my life, I made a decision. If he wanted to turn compassion into a violation, then the backlash was going to be something he wasn't prepared for. My mother had always been independent. Even as she got older, she insisted on doing things herself, cooking her own meals, managing her appointments, keeping her routine. So when her health began to decline, it happened quietly at first. Small warning signs we didn't immediately recognize as something serious. Then everything changed. She was hospitalized suddenly, and within days it became clear she couldn't be left alone. Breathing became difficult. Simple movements exhausted her. Doctors talked in careful language that never quite said what I wanted to hear, but said enough to make the fear real. I moved her into my home so I could care for her full time. My days stopped having structure. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were whatever I could grab between medications, doctor calls, and monitoring her condition. Every decision revolved around keeping her comfortable and safe. The house reflected that shift. The lawn didn't get mowed right away. Trash cans stayed out longer than usual. A few things that would normally be handled without thought simply weren't priorities anymore. Nothing unsafe, nothing extreme, just signs of a household focused on survival instead of appearances. Normally, that wouldn't have been an issue, but around that same time, a new HOA president had taken over. He was strict, procedural, obsessed with enforcement. He believed rules mattered more than context, and compliance mattered more than compassion. The neighborhood quickly learned that his version of leadership left very little room for discretion. At first, I didn't notice the emails. They blended in with everything else I was dealing with. But then the tone changed. Subject lines started including my address. Messages referenced violations, deadlines, consequences. One notice mentioned the lawn. Another mentioned trash placement. Another warned that continued non-compliance would result in fines. There was no check-in, no question about whether everything was okay, just violations, stacked neatly in my inbox while I sat beside my mother's bed, listening to machines hum and trying to stay calm for her sake. I assumed it would stop once he realized what was going on. I assumed wrong, because instead of easing up, the HOA president doubled down. And the moment I realized he knew exactly what I was dealing with and didn't care, was the moment this stopped being about rules entirely. It became about power and how far someone was willing to push it against the wrong person at the worst possible time. At first, I tried to explain. I replied to the HOA emails late at night after my mother finally fell asleep. I told him what was happening. I explained that I was caring for my sick mother full time, that her condition was serious, and that my focus was on keeping her stable. I asked for a little time, not forgiveness, just patience. His response came the next morning. It was short, cold, procedural. He said personal circumstances didn't exempt anyone from compliance. He said the HOA had a duty to enforce rules uniformly. He reminded me of deadlines and warned that fines would begin if violations weren't corrected immediately. There was no acknowledgement of my message, no empathy, just policy. The fines started within days. First it was the lawn, then the trash bins, then vague language about property appearance and ongoing neglect. Each notice came with a timestamp and a dollar amount, as if my life had been reduced to line items on a spreadsheet. I tried again. I sent another email. This time I was more detailed. I explained the medical situation more clearly. I told him my mother couldn't be left alone and that even short absences were risky. I asked whether a temporary accommodation was possible. His reply was even firmer. He said accommodations weren't his responsibility. He suggested I hire help if I couldn't manage my obligations. He reminded me that continued noncompliance could lead to further enforcement, including liens. Liens. The word sat heavy in my chest as I read it. I was already drowning, emotionally, physically, financially. Medical expenses were piling up. Time off work was unpaid. And now, on top of everything else, the HOA was threatening my home. The pressure didn't stay confined to emails. A notice was taped to my door while I was inside, helping my mother through a difficult afternoon. I didn't even hear it happen. I found it later, folded and official looking, outlining violations and warning of escalating consequences. A neighbor mentioned seeing the HOA president drive by slowly, taking photos. That's when the fear turned into something else. Anger, because by then, he knew. There was no question about that. I had told him, clearly, repeatedly. And instead of backing off, he was watching, documenting, and escalating, using the most vulnerable moment of my life as a leverage. The fines continued to stack. Each new notice referenced the previous ones, creating a paper trail designed to look justified, designed to make it seem like this was about compliance, not cruelty. I reached out to the HOA management company. I forwarded the emails. I explained the situation again. I asked whether there was any discretion during a medical emergency. Their response was cautious. They said enforcement decisions were made by the board president. They suggested I appeal after correcting the violations and paying the fines. Fix it first, pay first, then maybe we'll talk. That wasn't possible. I couldn't leave my mother alone long enough to deal with everything at once. And even if I could, the message was clear. Compassion wasn't part of the process. Things reached a breaking point one afternoon when my mother took a sudden turn for the worse. I spent hours on the phone with doctors, adjusting medications, monitoring symptoms, trying to stay calm for her sake. When I finally checked my email late that night, there was another message from the HOA. This one warned that if violations weren't resolved within a specified time frame, the board would consider further action. No explanation of what that meant, just a threat hanging in the air. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. He wasn't going to ease up. He wasn't going to show compassion, and he wasn't going to be satisfied until he proved he could enforce rules no matter the cost. So I stopped asking for understanding, and I started documenting everything. Every email, every notice, every fine, every time he acknowledged my situation and chose to escalate anyway. Because if he wanted to turn my worst moment into a violation, then the next phase of this story wasn't going to be about compliance. It was going to be about accountability. The breaking point came on a day I hadn't slept more than 2 hours. My mother had been up most of the night, struggling to breathe, her hands trembling every time she tried to sit up. I'd barely stepped away from her bedside when my phone buzzed again. Another HOA notice. This one wasn't about the lawn. It wasn't about trash. It was a final warning. The HOA president stated that continued noncompliance showed willful disregard for community standards and that the board would be pursuing escalated enforcement. He referenced liens again. He referenced legal action. He referenced protecting the integrity of the neighborhood. Reading it, something inside me finally snapped. Not fear, clarity. I realized that no amount of explaining, pleading, or documenting my situation was going to stop him, because he didn't see me as a person. I was a case file, a problem, a test of authority he was determined to win. So instead of replying, I made one phone call, then another. I contacted the HOA's management company again, but this time I didn't ask for discretion. I asked for their legal department. I sent them every email, every fine, every timestamp notice, along with a detailed timeline of my mother's medical emergency and my written disclosures to the HOA president. Then I contacted the city. I explained that while caring for a critically ill family member, I was being aggressively fined and threatened with a lien over minor property issues. I asked whether any protections existed for homeowners during documented medical emergencies. The response was immediate and very different from anything I'd heard before. They asked for documentation. I sent it. They asked whether the HOA president had been informed of the medical situation. I showed them the emails. They asked whether enforcement continued after disclosure. I forwarded everything. Within 48 hours, the tone changed completely. I received an email from the HOA's attorney, not the president. It stated that enforcement related to my property had been placed on a hold pending review. No fines, no deadlines, no threats. The next message came from the board itself. They were calling an emergency meeting. I attended remotely, sitting beside my mother's bed, one ear on her breathing and one ear on the meeting audio. The attorney summarized the situation. He explained that the HOA president had been notified of a serious medical emergency and had continued enforcement regardless. He explained that this exposed the HOA to potential claims of harassment and bad faith enforcement. He explained that discretion was not optional, it was a responsibility. Then the HOA president was asked to speak. He tried to justify himself. He said rules had to be enforced evenly. He said making exceptions was a slippery slope. He said he was protecting property values. The attorney interrupted him. He said enforcement is not the same as punishment. He said authority is not the same as power. And he said using fines to pressure someone during a documented medical crisis was indefensible. The board voted unanimously. All fines were voided. Enforcement against my property was terminated. And a formal letter was issued stating that no further action would be taken. The HOA president didn't argue after that. He went quiet. And in that silence, something unmistakable happened. His authority collapsed, not because I raised my voice, but because his cruelty finally had witnesses. Because once people saw what he was willing to do, when he was willing to do it, and to whom, there was no justifying it anymore. The backlash he never expected wasn't loud. It was final. After that meeting, the pressure stopped completely. No more emails, no more fines, no more notices taped to my door. A formal letter arrived a few days later confirming that all violations had been permanently dismissed and that enforcement related to my property was closed. The wording was careful and legal, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was over. The HOA president never contacted me again. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain himself. He simply disappeared from my life. Not long after, another announcement went out to the community. It talked about reviewing enforcement practices and updating procedures to allow for reasonable discretion in extraordinary circumstances. Medical emergencies were mentioned explicitly this time. That had never been in the rules before. Neighbors started reaching out quietly. Some expressed support. Others admitted they'd been uncomfortable watching what happened, but hadn't known how to intervene. A few said the situation made them rethink how much power they'd allowed one person to hold. As for my mother, her condition stabilized slowly. Recovery wasn't quick or easy, but having the HOA pressure lifted made an enormous difference. I could focus on her care without the constant fear of another threat landing in my inbox. The house didn't magically become perfect overnight. The lawn got trimmed when it could. The bins were handled when there was time. But now those things happened without fear attached to them. The experience left me changed. I learned that authority without empathy is dangerous, that rules enforced without context stop being about order and start becoming about control, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop asking for compassion and start insisting on accountability. HOAs exist to serve communities, not to punish people at their lowest. And when someone forgets that, the consequences don't always come as confrontation or public outrage. Sometimes they come quietly, through documentation, through witnesses, through people finally paying attention. The backlash he never expected wasn't dramatic, it was permanent. And in the end, that made all the difference.